All right, hello and welcome. In this video, I'd like to go over vertex painting. We are going to be creating a material using the height lerp, where we will blend between two materials and we'll use a height map to dictate where that blend happens. We'll be creating a material that has a base specific height map and then a ground or a dirt material that has a non-specific height map. So to demonstrate the material we'll be creating, we'll be able to paint here and blend cracks, and we can paint on top of the bricks where we are affecting the brick first and leaving the grout or the mortar second, or we can invert the material or the height map as to paint in the cracks first and paint up through the brick. So this is going to be good for if we want to paint on top of things and leaving the recesses and the crevices unaffected, or if we want to have like a mold or something filling through the depth of that material, we can invert it so we can paint in the cracks first or the depths first, leaving the exposed areas last. The second part of this, we're going to be painting on the floor. I'm going to blend water on top of our surface, and with this material we'll be able to paint water and puddles, and we can paint and erase, and we can also control the fall off or the blend between them with the contrast. So we can have really fresh puddles, or we can lower the contrast to have that puddle fall off and start to dry up. So the material looks something like this. Might seem a little bit daunting at first, but it's really not. If we break this down and look into each section, we just have a few nodes. We've got the input A and the input B, and we're blending that with this node height lerp. And if we go and we look at the roughness, we've got the same roughness A, roughness B, and a height lerp, normal A, normal B, and a height lerp. All of the outputs of the height lerps are going into the respective outputs. So the normal is going into normal, the roughness into roughness, and the base color into base color. My material parameters are all at default, nothing changed there. The only kind of functionality we need is a vertex color. We need an image in here. Typically this will be a height map, and then we have an invert, a 1- to invert it, a switch to say whether we want it inverted or not, and then a constant parameter for contrast to scale the amount of contrast. The water material is a little bit different. We have base color, input A, input B, and a height lerp. Roughness, we have an image and a value and the height lerp, and for normal we have an image and a value for the height lerp. We've got, instead of a height map, we just have a grayscale image of some noise or some clouds. Think of this as your brush for painting. So this is kind of a liquid map, and as we've got puddles here, and as we paint, we can either fill in the black areas first, moving up through the grays to the white, or we can invert that where we're painting in the whites first and moving down into the blacks. So let's start from scratch, and we'll begin with the wall material. I'm going to create a new material and call this example height lerp wall master. And right off the bat, I'm just going to right click this and create a material instance, and we'll call this height lerp wall, let's call it brick instance. So I'll assign the instance to my two walls, and let's open up the master. So the first thing I need is a height lerp. So I'm going to type in HEI and I'll hit enter to get a height lerp. Let's plug the result of this into the base color, and I'm going to select this and hit Control W 2 more times, and we'll plug the next one into our roughness and the next one into our normal. We've got errors, and the error is saying that we are missing the height texture, but we'll get to that in a moment. Next, I want to bring in my input A and input B, the two materials that I want to blend. So for this instance, I've downloaded a brick texture from Quixel Megascans, and I've brought in a concrete plaster material. If I go to bridge, we can see the materials I'm working with. I'm using chip paint wall 2x2M and classic brick wall 2x2M. I've downloaded their albedo, their displacement, their roughness, and their normal. I'm going to be using the albedo, roughness, and normal in my materials, and I'll be modifying the displacements in Photoshop to generate those height maps. So let's bring in the first two, and let's plug in the A and B into my height lerp. So I'll take the input A of the brick and the input B of my cement. Transition phase, this is a 0 to 1 value, whereby if we have black, we have no transition of B, or we're not showing any of B. And if we have 1, we are showing B, and anything in between is a mix of both. I'm going to use vertex color to drive the transition phase. bricks. So what I'll do is I'll take the red channel of vertex color, which is a grayscale value, and I'll plug this into each of the transition phases. Next, we have our height texture. I'm going to skip this for right now. We'll move on to the contrast. So the contrast is going to affect the control of the fall off between the blend of A and B. So for this, I'm just going to right click and promote to parameter. And what this does is this fills it in with the name of the input over here. So we've got contrast and it's got an S here in parentheses, and that's for scalar. So we'll grab this contrast and I'm going to set my default value to 0. I don't want any contrast, and I'll set my slider max up to something like 10. All right, so with the contrast scalar created, I'm going to input that into each of my height lerps. Let's go back to the content browser and let's bring in the rest of our textures here. So next I'll grab the normal maps for both, and I always want to make sure that my A and B are the same for each of the height lerps. So I want to make sure that the brick is always going into A and the concrete is always going into B. And then lastly, let's grab our roughnesses. So our brick roughness and our concrete roughness. So we've got brick on top, concrete on the bottom, and let's plug our concrete into B and our brick into A. So I'm going to tidy up the material editor real quick, pull my base color up there, line up the roughness, and let's bring our normal map down here. Okay, so the only thing that we're missing right now is our height texture. So this texture is going to define where the blend happens first, meaning if I have recesses in the cracks, I can target those areas before the higher areas, or I'm going to use a simple invert to invert that. But let's go and let's create our height texture for our brick first. So what I'll do is I'll take the displacement for my bricks and we'll take a look at it. There's not a lot of range in this image, meaning that I don't have value from black to white. Rather, I've just got what looks like this middle gray. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to export this texture and bring it into Photoshop. So I can simply right click on the texture, go to Asset Actions, and export. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the image in Photoshop, and you'll see that it comes in all red. So if I take a look at the modes, we're in RGB color and we're at 32 bits per channel. Okay, a regular texture is an 8-bit texture, 8 bits per channel, 24 bits per pixel, meaning that there's 8 bits for the red, 8 bits for the green, and 8 bits for the blue. When you combine those, add those 3 numbers up, you get 24 bits. So what I want to do is I want to target the channels, and I'm going to go into my red and see that I've got this image here in the red. So I'm going to copy this image with Control A and Control C, and I'm going to hit Control N to open up a new document. And this new document, I want to make sure that I'm at 2K, my resolution is at 72 pixels per inch, and my color mode is RGB color, and I'm at 8 bits per channel. I'll hit create, and then I'm going to make sure I'm back in the layers. I'll delete this base here, and I'll just hit Control Shift V to paste. Once I've pasted it in, now I can delete that old background. So I'll name this brick, and I'm going to hit Control L to bring up the levels. And you can see here in the levels that I've got a lot of in the midtones, but I don't have much in the blacks or in the whites. So I'm going to go ahead and just drag this to the start of my ramp there, and I'll do the same down here for the blacks. This is giving me a wider range from black to white. And what we'll see is that part of the cracks now are actually getting a full black value, and some of the tops of the bricks are getting full white. Now, this image would work, but it doesn't work enough. What I want is I want to have the grout be much, much more dark. So what I'll do is I'll go back to Unreal and I'm going to grab this image here. What we can see here is that the grout, this is the roughness texture for that brick, and the grout is bright, meaning that it is very matted, and the bricks are more kind of middle gray, meaning that they're going to be smoother. But I'm going to be able to process this image in Photoshop to where I can target the grout to be darker. So I'm going to do the same and export this out and open it up in Photoshop, and I've got it here. Control C, I'll go back to my new document, and I'll hit Control Shift V to paste. I'll call this roughness just so I have an idea of what this is, and I'll bring up the levels again. So here I'll just process these a little bit so I've got kind of some more range, and I'll hit OK. Next, I'll invert the image, and now we can see that my grout is darker than my bricks, and this is the result that I want. But I also want to have this kind of undulating surface of the bricks so that we can have some bricks get filled in completely before others. So I need to combine these two. So I'll click on my blend mode and I'll just select darken, and then I'm just going to hit the arrow keys and move through here until I see a blend mode that I like. What I think I'll do is just select multiply. If I turn on and off, we really see that that multiply kind of kills the base texture, the value that I had in there. So what I can do with this multiply is I can just kind of feather back the opacity here a bit, or I could come back in and kind of process the levels on this to where I'm getting more of the dark and kind of get this image where I want it. So something like this should work. The result that I ended up getting, I'll show here, and it's here where I've still got some of that white, on these tips of the bricks. The bricks themselves have more range in them, but all I did was process these images using levels and blend modes and different opacity values. So once I have this texture where I want, I'll go ahead and hit export, file, save as, and I'll save this something like height packed. What I'll eventually do is pack a couple different images into each of the channels, but for now I'm just using one channel. I'm going to save this out as a targa so it comes into Unreal as uncompressed, because Unreal will do some compression on its side. All right, so like I said, I've got this image here and it's processed like this, and this we're going to plug in to the height range. So let's drag this texture in, and I'm going to pull out in the red, because if it's grayscale, red will just show the red channel. If it's packed, I know that this is going to be the first packed channel. So I'll grab my red and I'm going to input that into the height texture for all of my height lerps. Okay, so for now, that's mostly it. I've got my two textures here. They're all plugged into height lerps, and I've got my vertex color, the red channel of my vertex color, into the transition phase. I've got a constant scalar parameter into the contrast, and I've got a height texture plugged into each of the height lerps height texture input. With this, I'm going to save and we'll see how this works. Okay, so we've already got some vertex painting or some mesh painting applied to these materials. So what I'll do is I'll select the mesh paint mode and I'm going to just select remove. This one actually is full of information. So this mesh here, what I can do is hit swap colors and fill. Make sure I have that mesh selected, swap color, fill. All right, I'll hit swap colors again. And now what I can do is I can just start to paint on my meshes and blend those two materials. I can adjust the size. I can hold shift to erase, and I can also adjust my strength. Here I'm just clicking and you can see how it's starting to fill in. So if we notice, this one is filling in or painting on top of the bricks first and painting in the recesses last. And that's based on the invert that I had in the original material. So one thing I would like to demonstrate now is if I open up this material instance, I've got this contrast scalar. So right now I have no contrast, meaning that the blend between my input A and my input B is very gradual or very soft. This will also depend on the placement of the vertices. You can see here that this mesh is quite dense. I don't recommend your meshes being this dense. You could probably remove 3/4 of this topology and be just fine. But now I'm going to take my contrast and scale it up, and you can see how we can get different blends. So here I think this looks more realistic, as this might have been a painted over brick. And again, as I start to click, you'll see that it fills the top of the brick first and leaves those recesses of the grout second. I'll go ahead and just hit shift and erase some of this, and we can really get this like nice painted on top of brick look here with this. It's all gonna kind of depend on the sensitivity of your brush at this point, but we can get something like this, which I think looks pretty good. If again, the look we were going for is we want paint on top of brick. Maybe this was really rushed and a really poor job. The paint didn't adhere to the cracks that well. The painter didn't get in there that well. Anyways, this is just one look that we can get. Now, if we want the inverse, we want to fill in the cracks first. If we were going to do something like mold or moss or dirt, grunge, grime, whatever we want, we need to add that invert. So let's open up the master again. And all we have to do for this is place an invert right after this texture sample. So I'm going to right click and type in 1, O-N-E, and I'm going to grab a 1-. Next, I'm going to hold down Control and grab the pins from the red channel and plug them into the output of the 1-. Then I'll take the red and plug that back into the input of the 1-. Let's apply this, and then let's go take a look. So now you can see the opposite has happened, where we are filling in the cracks first, leaving the tops of the bricks for last. Again, this is a great look. This also, I think, looks really good. Again, it's all going to depend on what you're going for. Maybe this was a plaster, someone's plastered over the brick and that plaster has started to fall off, but it's really adhered or kept to the roughness of that grout. Or if we wanted to change that second input to be something like moss or dirt, we can do so. At the moment, it's either or. So what I want to do now is give myself the control to switch that parameter. So I'm going to right click back in my master material and start to type in static switch parameter. So here I'll grab a static switch parameter and I'm going to name this height invert. And whether I'm going to mostly want to have it one way or the other would depend how I set up the true or the false. The default is false. So basically this is a switch. If true, we will switch it. So the false would be default. So if I wanted the base as the false and the inverted to be the true after the switch, I can set it up like this. If I wanted the opposite of that, I would just need to switch these pins like so. For the sake of the cleanliness of the material though, I'm gonna have it this way. And then again, I'm gonna grab control and plug all the outputs into the switch, and then I'll plug the 1- into the true. I'll go ahead and hit apply, and we'll head back to our material instance. And now you can see with the flick of a switch, we can invert that height. So that's a really cool option to have and can really go a long way. So that almost completes the material. Just gonna do a little bit of organizing here. And the last thing I want to do is I want to give myself the ability to swap out these images. So let's start with the base color. I'm going to right click on the base color for my brick and select convert to parameter. I'm going to call this input A texture, and I'll do the same for the B. We'll move down to the roughness and repeat roughness A texture and roughness B texture. Lastly, we'll convert our normal maps, and finally our height lerp texture. All right, so I'm going to open up my two materials, my master on the left and my instance on the right. And once I hit apply, we'll see that I now get the option to change all of these input textures. We'll go ahead and check these on for the ability to swap out the textures, but it's starting to get a little messy. So what I want to do is I want to set up some grouping in my master material. So the first set of parameters I want really are these ones here. So I want these at the top. So I'm going to select my height lerp parameter, and we'll see that I've got a group option that right now is set to none. And I also have a sort priority that's set to 32. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this height lerp, and I'm going to set the sort priority to be 1. This means that it'll fall first in the list. So if I minimize this and hit apply, we'll see that that height lerp input moves to the bottom. I think right now, because these are all at default, they're at the top. So let's go ahead and continue. My contrast, I'm going to also put in the height lerp group, and I'll set its priority to 2. And what this is this is the order in which they show up in their respective groups. So that's why the other groups were still at the top, because they were actually ungrouped. So now we should see the height lerp input at the top with the contrast scalar below it. And there we go. In the height lerp group, I have the height lerp texture first and the contrast scalar next. I'm going to take a look at the contrast. So for the contrast, I want to make sure that the default value is 0, the slider min is 0, and the max is something above 1. Anything higher than 1 is just going to give me a more gradual transition. So let's continue with the grouping. I'll select both these nodes at the same time, and I'll give them a group of base color. I'll set my input A sort priority to 1 and my input B sort priority to 2. We'll do the same for roughness. Give them a group called roughness. Select the input A to 1 and B to 2. And finally, our normal. Input A set to 1 and input B set to 2. Once I apply this, we'll see that our grouping gets rearranged here. Looks like we missed the height invert. I want to put that in the height lerp options. So I'll just select the drop down, select height lerp, and I'll set that priority to 3. And that should fall below the contrast. All right, lastly, I want to do some organization in the material editor. So I'm going to select all these nodes, hit C for comment. We'll call this height lerp. We'll grab these 3, hit C, call this base color, roughness, and normal. So now we can quickly reorganize, space these out however we like, and we have a fairly clean material setup. So that completes it for the wall material. Let's close the master. Let's minimize the material instance, and let's see what we can do with this now. So I've got some Vertex paint laid down, and I can, again, control whether I want that fall off to be sharp or smooth. I can invert that height, so I can fill in the bricks either first or the grout first, and I can swap out all of my materials. So let's say that I want to keep my brick texture, but instead I want to blend some kind of a moss. So I've got some moss, base color, normal, and roughness. So let's go ahead and swap our textures out here. So I'll just grab the moss base color, plug it into the B. Let's grab the moss normal, plug it into the B of my normal, and the moss roughness into the B of my roughness. Now with the moss, it makes sense to fill in the cracks first. So let's just show this inverted. And with the moss as well, I think that a sharper contrast looks best. Let's go ahead and invert this. And there we go. We can select these now and I can remove them, and we'll see that it removes in a much more natural, realistic way, and we can paint or blend moss and brick. Okay, so next, let's take a look at our water material. So the setup is almost identical. You can see that I've got base color with the height lerp, but instead of the value B, I'm multiplying color by my original base color so I can darken that, because if you pour water on something, the color value tends to darken. Next, for my roughness, I've got the roughness of my base or my floor here, which is actually a brick texture right now. Let me fix that. And for the roughness for water, well, water isn't rough, so we just have a constant or a scalar parameter with a value of 0. Next is my normal. I've got the normal for my floor, but you'll notice that the normal of my water is just a constant 3 with a value of 1 in the blue. The height lerp is exactly the same, where I'm using the red channel plugged into each of my transition phases of my height lerps. I've got a 1- if I want to switch that or invert it, and I've got a contrast scalar parameter plugged into the contrast of my height lerp. The only difference here is the image I'm inputting into my height lerp input. I've got this kind of cloudy, watery, wet map texture, and to create that, I actually took the displacement of the rough stone wall, and the displacement for that is what I brought into Photoshop and processed. I'll go through that now. So I'm going to take the displacement, which looks like this. I'm going to export it out just the same as I did before. So again, this displacement, I'm going to want to go into the channels, isolate the red, Control A, Control C, Control N. Now careful when you grab a channel, because what happens is it switches the color mode to grayscale. Everything else is fine. 2K by 2K, 72 resolution, pixels per inch. The only thing I need to do is change the grayscale to RGB color. I want to make sure I'm on 8 bits per channel, and everything else should be fine. So in my new channel, in my new document, I'm gonna hit Control Shift V, and we'll double click on the background and then delete it. I'm going to hit Control L to bring up my levels, and I'm just going to process this. So I'm using the full range. Whether I want a bit more contrast, I can adjust it here. I'd like about this amount of contrast. Then I'm going to go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. I'm going to blur this so that I have this kind of splatter map here. The more I crank up the radius on the blur, the less information I get. I don't really want this kind of sharpness. I want to get it to where there's still black and there's still white, but the fall off in the grays is much more gradated. So once I'm happy with this, I can save this out. Or what I was showing before, I'm going to grab this, Control A, Control C, and I can go back to my packed image here, and I can go into my channels, and I can pack this into the green channel. I'm going to go into my blue, hit Control A, and hit Delete. So I'm actually going to create a new document. I'm going to hit Control N, 2K, 72, RGB, 8 bits. We'll hit Create. So here's where I'm going to pack those textures. So I'm going to go back to my brick. I'm going to hit Control A, C, my new document, make sure I'm in the red channel, hit Control V, and I've pasted that brick height into the red channel of my pack texture. Next, I'll go to my wet map, Control A, Control C, go back to here, go into my green channel, and hit V to paste. I'll actually fill this blue channel with black for the time being. I could always pack something else in there, but right now I've got 2 pack textures in the red and the green. If I look at the combined RGB, we'll see that the bricks are in red and the wet map is what's green. So let's export this out. I'll save this as a target. I want to make sure it's 24 bits per pixel. Again, that's meaning 8 bits per red, 8 bits per green, 8 bits per blue, and we'll import this texture. So the first thing I need to do is I need to open up this texture by double clicking it, and I need to uncheck sRGB. sRGB means that it's a color texture and it has a gamma correction applied to it so that when displayed on our monitors, it looks natural to us. Because we're essentially packing grayscale images in here, images with information from 0 to 1, we don't want that gamma curve applied. If I open up Chrome and I type in gamma correction and I go to images, can open up this image here. So we'll see that we've got a linear color space and a gamma corrected. Okay. So again, my values, when they're linear, if my value is 0, it's 0. As it moves up and goes all the way to 1, my value is 1. But if I were to look at 0.5, well, 0.5 in linear space is 0.5. But if I look at it with the gamma correction applied to it, well, that gets moved over and doesn't look correct. If I take 50 or 0.5 and I go up to here, again, I'm at 50%. But if I move up here with a gamma corrected value, I'm actually at 75, okay? So this is why those pack textures, they're technically not colored textures. So we want to uncheck sRGB. I could even select the compression and set it to mask, no sRGB, and that would uncheck the sRGB for me. So if I wanted to use my pack textures now, I could drag it in, and here we are in our water. So we know that the image that we want for water is in our green channel. So we would just pull out the green and replace it. And then in our wall, we'll do the same thing. We're targeting the red channel, so we'll swap out the red channel for that. Now, the other thing to note is that if I select this texture sampler, we'll notice that it's set to masks. Whereas if I were to select a default texture or the texture image before, the sampler type would be set to color. So with the water material created, now we should be able to select the water or select the floor planes, go into mesh paint. Let's adjust our strength up a bit. And with left clicking or control and left clicking, we can now paint water. If we open up the material instance, we've got some parameters. We've got our water color, which we can change to anything. This is just multiplying our base color with this value. We have our contrast, which we can again increase to get a sharper fall off or lower to get a wider fall off. And we've also got the ability to control the roughness of the water. If we wanted it kind of dry, we could adjust the roughness there. All right, so there you have it. I hope that you enjoyed this. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to leave them in the comments below, and I'll catch you all in the next one.